Brazil is the only country to have won the World Cup 5 times, a memorable international achievement by anyone's standards. Brazil's dream team of 1970 is considered to be the best of all time. But there is one World Cup loss for Brazil that will forever stand out in the minds of its people. It was the World Cup of 1950, and it took place right here in Rio at Maracanazo Stadium. It was viewed as a national sports tragedy and still ignites strong emotions in Brazilians. Some wonder, in 2014, could history repeat itself? Correspondent Joel Richards reports.
It's often said that of the unimportant things in the world, football is the most important. And there are a few places where that is as true as it is in Uruguay.
This is one of the oldest derbies in world football, Peñarol against Nacional, two sides who historically have not only dominated Uruguayan football, but also produced players for the national team.
Between them, they have won 66 league titles, as well as South American and World Club Championships. But Uruguayan football has long suffered in quality from the exodus of young players, and recently there have been problems off the pitch, supporters clashing with police at matches, attracting unwanted headlines, and also even suspension of the league. But when it comes to the national team, it's been a different story in recent years. With a talented generation of players and the skillful guidance of coach Oscar Tabares, Uruguay reached the 2010 World Cup semi-finals and were South American champions in 2011.
I define football culture as those who have a population for whom their national team is part of the national identity.
The Centenario is Uruguay's spiritual home. Its name is a tribute to the 100-year anniversary of the first national constitution, and that year Uruguay were world champions. They won the Olympic Games in 1924 and 1928, and when the World Cup was created, they were named hosts. And in the first final, Uruguay defeated Argentina 4-2.
Uruguay has great tradition in the World Cup, not just for the 1930 tournament, which Uruguay hosted and won here at this stadium, but also for 1950, arguably one of the biggest upsets in world football that took place in Brazil.
Winning a second World Cup in Brazil, 1950 confirmed Uruguay as a major power in the game. Jonathan Wilson has written several books, including Inverting the Pyramid, on the history of football.
It's an extraordinary thing to do it with that few people, and not only to do it once, but to sustain it for 20 years. I mean, they went 24 years without losing a World Cup match.
The 1950 victory is immortalised in Uruguay. The World Cup was played under a different format to today. The last game pitched Brazil against Uruguay, the home team needing just a draw to win the title. And while Brazil had comfortably defeated teams in the group stage of the competition, Uruguay had struggled to win. Home advantage and form pointed to a Brazil win. Maracanazo was the stadium built for that tournament in the context of a country coming out of the dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas. It was an icon for the new Brazil, the biggest stadium in the world. It said the streets of Montevideo were empty for the start of the game, the nation awaiting the final. The Uruguay captain on that day was Obdulio Varela, El Negro Jefe.
They say that when Uruguay was about to enter the field in that day, the Negro Jefe, the Capitán Obdulio Varela, waited until the first Brazilian guy entered too. So in that way, they weren't going to be whistled, because of course you have to understand that there were 200,000 people.
Uruguay was led by Varela. Blood on his shirt, testament to a heavy-handed final, can still be seen at the National Football Museum. But the hero was Alcides Ghiggia. Brazil had taken an early lead and seemed certain to secure the World Cup. But Uruguay equalised, Schiaffino scoring in the 66th minute. And with just 11 minutes remaining, Brazil still set to win the World Cup. Ghiggia beat his man to score the winner. In front of 200,000 Brazilians, the players celebrated, and in Montevideo, people took to the streets. Ghiggia is the last surviving player from the team that dealt the biggest blow in World Cup history. He often repeats his most famous line about his goal.
Only 3 people silenced the Maracanazo: the Pope, Frank Sinatra and me.
Ghiggia's winner put him in the World Cup Hall of Fame, having delivered an unthinkable result.
The president of the FIFA in that time had wrote a speech. The speech said that Brazil is going to be the champion of the world. So when the game ended, the president of FIFA, Rimet, didn't know what to do. Delivered the cup to the Uruguayan captain, but there was no ceremony, there was no anthem.
While Uruguay celebrated, for Brazil it was a national trauma. Even though the country has since won several World Cups, more than any other nation, not winning at home is still considered a national failure.
Just as the Maracanazo continues to haunt Brazilian football to a certain extent, there's also the sense in which it does the same here in Uruguay, and the country's greatest World Cup achievement now in the distant past.
For new generations, subliminally, the message was that those who won back then were champions, not the new generation, as if nothing we did was valued, like Maracanazo.
For this year's World Cup, the Maracanazo has been rebuilt, but for Uruguayans, it is still a monument to their greatest ever victory. Ruben Sosa scored one of the goals of the Copa America in 1989 at the Maracanazo against Argentina. He was one of the leading players of his generation that won the tournament in '87 and were runners-up in Brazil in '89.
It is remembered because it was against Maradona's Argentina. I got the ball at halfway.
Sosa says 1950 is still revered by Uruguayan players.
There will not be something like it. There will only ever be one Maracanazo. Playing there, it wasn't a burden, but rather it was a form of praise.
He's now a youth team coach. He works at Nacional and also has his own school. Sosa had an illustrious career in Europe, playing for Inter Milan amongst other clubs, but says that in Uruguay there's an attachment to the shirt that comes from the nation's rich football tradition.
The most important thing is your country, defending your country.
It is this spirit and belief in the national team that Oscar Tabares is credited with instilling in the current crop of players. With his side in the so-called group of death, along with Italy, England and Costa Rica, the Uruguay coach turns questions about a possible repeat around.
I hope we play Brazil. It means we would have passed the group stage.
The Maracanazo is the centerpiece of Uruguay's football narrative, a victory and achievement unlikely to ever be repeated.
The last 4 World Cup tournaments held in South America were all won by South American teams. Maracanazo Stadium was the biggest in the world when it was completed in 1950. In recent months, it underwent a lavish renovation.